a lot of garbage over there. Do you need any help?
No, I got it. I'm fine. They'll figure it out.
Well, I'm not sure they will. You see, an automated truck comes and picks up the garbage cans and takes the refuse to the landfill. Then a separate truck comes and picks up these large bulk items such as the carpet and lumber. And then another truck comes and picks up the recycling and takes it to the recycling center. If you're not organized, they can't pick them up.
What? That's ridiculous. It's all garbage. It ends up in the same place. Why does it have to be so complicated?
Well, it's not really that complicated. There's just a few simple rules to help you stay better organized and help see that stuff goes where it's supposed to go. For instance, these bags on top of the can, if you've got things that won't fit into your can, you can still bag them up and put them on the curb lawn for the bulk truck to pick up. Just make sure you leave enough space between the cans so that the automated truck can pick it up.
I guess that's not that complicated. Plus, it won't be all over my yard from the wind.
Yeah. Next, that carpet does not belong in the recycling bin. It's not recyclable.
What? Are you sure? It looks recyclable.
Think of it this way. Things that are recyclable can be reused, such as cans and bottles that could be melted down and used again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, that carpet is just nothing but rotten fabric and bad glue. Would you reuse it?
No, my husband and my dog made sure of that. He's a sloppy eater.
Which one?
Exactly.
Anyway, that carpet, that should be cut and tied into manageable 4-foot bundles, like that lumber too. And then just simply set it on the curb lawn for the bulk truck to pick up. Look, if you have any questions, just call the sanitation department and ask them, or go to the City of Elyria website.
What are you doing? That doesn't go in there.
It does. Who are you? William Rittenhouse?
Who?
He created the first recycling center in the 17th century. I thought you would know that since you're the world's authority now, foremost on recycling, apparently.
And who are you, Baron von Schwartenmouth? FYI, he created, shut up. See this? It's shiny. You can't recycle shiny things.
That's funny. This brochure from the city that's shiny and recyclable says you can't.
Well, Smarty Pants, what's your brochure say about recycling half a lasagna? Just because your food tastes like cardboard doesn't mean it's cardboard.
It's in a cardboard container.
So, empty the food, recycle the container. But look at these. Half of these water bottles are still half full. You're supposed to take the tops off, empty it out, and then recycle them.
While the lasagna's in a cardboard container and there are beer bottles in there, I don't see them half full. You make sure they're completely empty before you get rid of them.
Well, that's a baby food jar. What have you been feeding the baby?
Baby food. Baby food. Those are recyclable?
What's your brochure say? Let's see. Oh, it says glass bottles and jars, plastic food and beverage containers, number 1 through 7, are all recyclable. So I guess that covers pretty much everything you could put food in.
Huh, well, I see one problem.
What?
In here. They're all shiny. That blows away your super scientific shininess principle you have.
You got me. But I'll tell you what, I'm smart enough to know this lasagna is still edible.
I'm Mayor Holly Brenda, and I want to welcome you to Elyria City Hall for our third and final session of JumpStart Elyria. We really appreciate your participation coming out this morning and sticking with this process over an extended period of time. I think it's very important that we've had some of the same people providing input and kind of seeing the evolution of this data. Today we've got all of our partners with us today, Partners for Economic Solutions, Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, and Street Sense. As you know, we did obtain a $93,000 Transportation for Livable Communities grant to be able to pay for this process. And the process is a little bit different than we've done before. It's a redevelopment planning process for downtown, Midway, and the Cleveland Street area, but it's also using the benefit of market analysis. We need to see where Elyria's strengths and weaknesses are. We need to identify the gaps in the market, both internally and around us, and capitalize on it. And we're hoping that the combination of using this market analysis data and looking at our assets, that we're going to be able to put together an effective plan that will help move our community forward. So again, we appreciate your help. You're going to hear some things this morning that there's good news and there's bad news. And I would just like to say to you, while you're going to hear that this is going to be a challenging process, we can't move forward until we identify where the challenges are. And that's what we're trying to do here. It's been a long time coming, and the ship is not going to turn overnight. But we have to identify where the challenges are, and we have to identify the steps to begin to take to move our community forward. So I would ask that you not get discouraged, because we are very committed to taking this redevelopment plan and moving it forward with your assistance. It is not going to be something that the city can do by itself. You're going to hear about the need for public-private partnership. You're going to learn about the need for having collaborative conversations in and around our community, seeking funding both inside and outside the region and nationally. And I think one of the strengths of this presentation is we're going to not only talk about what we should do, but we're going to talk about how to do it, and we're going to talk about how to fund it. So again, I ask for your continued patience. We are committed to updating you on this process too. So when you leave today, it's not the last time we're going to talk about this. We are going to begin to execute these plans immediately, and you can expect to get a notice from us on 2 meetings a year over the next few years, just so you know where we are, what our progress has been, where some of the challenges are, and how maybe you can help. So with that, I will turn the program over to Terry Schwartz, and we'll begin. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Just a couple of really quick housekeeping questions. In the last meeting, we got comment sheets from all of you, and one of the comments that came up a few times was that for some of you it was hard to hear. I think particularly those of you under the balcony area, if you're having a hard time hearing, please give us a sign, because we want to make sure that you're part of the conversation. So you can't hear, it's not loud enough. Okay, I'll speak up. The other thing is that at the last couple of meetings, we've had a presentation and then saved comments for the end. This meeting is really, it's important to get comments throughout. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a summary of the market analysis. That's the piece that Abby and Heather did initially that took a snapshot of where the community is today. Then we're going to talk about downtown. We're going to talk about infrastructure improvements, some of the things we talked about at the last meeting, and also talking about economic development strategies for downtown. Then we'll pause, turn up the lights, and we'll have a conversation and a discussion with all of you. After we finish the downtown, we'll move on to the Midway District and the same process. We'll show some slides with the recommendations, economic recommendations, infrastructure recommendations, and then we'll have Q&A. And then finally, we'll close with the Cleveland Street recommendations and conversation. At the end of the meeting, we'll open it up to you, kind of anything that you want to talk about related to the plan, and also the 5 of us will stick around. So if you don't necessarily want to like raise your hand and ask a question or correct us or make some, kind of suggestions and recommendations, we'll all be here to capture that input. So this meeting is the first. We're going to also have this meeting in the evening where, another group of people will come in and be part of the conversation. Following that, we're going to capture all of this into the deliverables on the project, which are it's the plan report, it's the final market study, and economic development recommendations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abby and Heather, who will talk about the market analysis.
Good morning, everybody. Excuse me. If you were here for the last meeting, you know that Abby and I both worked together to conduct a market analysis of the 3 areas in Elyria that were identified for this project, which, if you're not aware, that's the Midway Mall area, which we now call the Midway District, the downtown area, and Cleveland Street as well. And through looking at those 3 areas, what we were really trying to do was to figure out what the potential for each of those areas were and what the real estate strength in each of those areas were, with the end goal of being what is the ability of the private sector to move forward the changes that the people in Elyria want to see happen. The next thing that we did was determine what were the competitive advantages of the city as opposed to not just other cities within Lorain County, but outside of the area as well. And then we tried to figure out what was the gap between what the private sector was willing to commit to in terms of investment in those 3 specific areas, but also what was the gap between what they would be able to provide and what was actually feasible in terms of current market conditions. And then we put this, and that's where we are right now, is to figure out what were the recommended strategies to move forward. I want to emphasize that we put a real focus for this economic development strategy, not just on looking at the challenges, but also looking at what were the opportunities and how should we prioritize them. And I can tell you right from the beginning that our priority was on projects that would have impact beyond themselves. So what were things that could be done that would change district-wide perceptions, market-wide perceptions, or would even affect the ability of sites on either side of a project to become more feasible from a market perspective. So I really wanted to emphasize the focus that we put on the ability of our recommendations to catalyze bigger things. We started with what were the real strengths of Elyria in terms of competitive advantage. And I wanted to highlight some of them because, as the mayor said, we have good news and bad news, so we wanted to start with a positive focus. Looking at Elyria, it's very clear to everyone, and you don't even have to look at your marketing brochures to know that the natural beauty of Elyria is absolutely part of its charm and its distinction. And access to that natural beauty is a selling point from a real estate market perspective across all categories. The history of this area certainly contributes to that as well. The downtown area as it exists today would have much less of a firm hold in future potential if it had all been developed in 1973. The ability of this area to reflect not just a time that's gone by, but a time when downtowns meant something very different than they do in most places today is absolutely a point of strength that needs to be emphasized in this assessment. And then the third one is a sense of community within Elyria. The idea that you all not only self-recognize yourself as part of the community, but that you actively participate in it through a variety of ways that are true whether you have children in the school system or not. That it is a place that you call home, that you identify with it as your hometown, and that its future is also linked to yours. So what we did from Street Sense and Partners for Economic Solutions perspective is that we looked at 4 categories of real estate uses and determined how they were all best represented within the 3 different nodes that we discussed earlier. So we looked at your housing potential, we looked at the office conditions, we evaluated the retail markets, and we looked at the conditions and potential for lodging and hospitality within those 3 areas. And our market conclusions came to the following. Within the Midway area, we had the opportunity for about 140 multifamily housing units at market conditions in that area. Within the downtown area, there was potential for historic lofts, a very specific condition of the residential real estate market along Broad Street, specifically in the downtown area. Flex office at the Midway District, we could support between 20,000 and 30,000 square feet. And we saw opportunity for infill office within the downtown area, once again along Broad Street. We have an issue with the lodging industry that I think is worth bringing to your attention. We're having some issues with the shrinking economy of the hospitality market, particularly in areas that are relying on traveler stays within that market, and Abby's going to expand on that a little bit more. But it basically showed that we did not have a great deal of additional lodging market to absorb. And from a retail perspective, instead of discussing additional retail demand, we wanted to find ways for you to capitalize on the retail demand that's here in a way that would be, I would say, more impactful. And that goes to this idea that instead of having more retail, you have more of the right kind of retail, more better retail, if you will, for lack of a better term. And we will discuss that in just a minute when we talk about the downtown area. And more importantly, we needed to find ways to create a sense of market distinction that gave retailers a reason to want to be in a downtown condition as opposed to a suburban strip mall type of center. And when we talk about all of these things, we want to really emphasize the fact that we view the economic development strategy and the potential for Elyria's growth and improvement to really be a three-legged stool, where we look at the ability to create some kind of unique condition within Elyria as something that is the responsibility and the opportunity of not just the private sector and your local government, but also the community itself. That if all three of these aren't part of the discussion and the solution, it's not going to stand. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Abby, and she's going to talk a little bit about what all this means from a technical perspective.
Thanks, Heather. So I'm going to talk, and I want you to raise your hands if you can't understand me. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. So as Heather just said, what our market conclusion showed was that there was demand. Part of the reason the lodging piece shows no additional demand is because there's already a plan in the pipeline, as you well know, so that kind of absorbs the future immediate potential for demand. And there's a segmentation in that lodging industry, so we don't expect anything but shrinkage of more of the economy. So your Super 8 motels and your lower end, those price points will shrink in size in terms of the lodging market, but we know that there's a growth on the upper scale of the lodging market. So in terms of market demand, we showed you that there was demand. We showed that there was demand for multifamily residential. We showed that there was demand for office. We're talking about flex office, product, 1 to 2 stories, 30,000 to 40,000 square feet. That demand in that market does not mean that someone will come in tomorrow or today and build those things. What that means is that you have potential for that, but in order to attract private investment, in order to get that residential builder to build that multifamily product in the Midway District, you need to make sure that your demand and your attracted dollars returns the investment to that private developer. So we're going to take a minute here and look at this graphic with the red and the green. So the green is outflow of money and inflow of money. At the bottom, you see that I have what talks about initial capital. Over a period of time, when you're an investor making a choice, whether you're deciding to open a new hotel, whether you're deciding to build that multifamily apartment building, whatever your option is, you make a decision to invest money. You do construction, you buy or acquire the land, and that costs you money, as you would expect, and that money is expended over a period of time. Typically, and as we're showing it here, 24 months to 36 months. You don't have a return on your investment. Your apartments aren't constructed, you're not receiving rent from them, they're not pre-leased. Even if you have a signed contract with a letter of intent, there is no revenue going into your back pocket. You are outlaying that money with the understanding that in the future it will be returned to you. And that's true whether your position is to sell the property once it's constructed or to own it for 35, 40 years, infinity. So in that calculation that you make in the back of your mind, you need to have an understanding and a belief that the rents that you will receive, if you're going to maintain it long term, or that the rents that another investor could receive, in their mind, is going to equal that investment that you've put out there. And it's a risk. It's a risk that we all take on. When we make a decision to become homeowners, we take on a similar type of risk. We assume that we'll pay off that mortgage, and at the end of time, when we're done with that house, that we can sell it, that we can, not take a loss, right? It's an investment, it's a choice. What we see in Elyria very clearly is that the lower rents and the cost of taking on this risk is higher than most people. If you talk to somebody here who owns a building in downtown, they will tell you that they have trouble keeping their tenants, that their rents that they get and receive every month are either not consistent every month because their tenants don't have a stable cash flow, or they will tell you that the time that they have to spend when that tenant leaves and cleaning up that space, or just the operations of the building and what that property owner has to do, are not meeting that gap. Unless they purchased the building years and years and years ago, there is a gap today that exists. So while the market could demand additional product type and additional units, the availability of those private investors to spend their money and get the return on investment is not there. So what they do is they take their money to other locations, whether it's in Lorain County itself or even other locations outside the region, and they invest their dollars other places where they can get that required return on investment. So everyone sees that green dotted line, and then you see in red the gap there. Actually, the green dotted line looks like it's moved down. It fell down. It dropped down. What we would love to see, if this was animated, is that green line. That's normally where you would see it, meeting where you expect that rental income. So there would just be a gap for a short period of time in red. What's actually true of Elyria is that we're at the top of that gap line. So you see that there's a gap that persists, and it persists, it keeps going over time. That's if we stay where we are today in this static place. What we're talking about is a series of investments from the public sector to adjust it so that that required line drops down to where it is right now in today's presentation. And it drops down to show you that there will be a period of time when that investor will not be able to return it, but that in the short term, they will, and they'll understand that, and they'll take that risk for that red period of time in the beginning to get to a good return on investment. So essentially, if you're putting that money in, you want to know you're either getting the money out by selling the property once it's done with construction or even after the first couple of years of stabilization, or you want to know that there's a mechanism to support that gap so that you can have a longer-term view as the market changes. So I'm going to just pause here for 1 second, and I want you to be brave and raise your hand if this concept seems challenging or not to make sense, or you have immediate questions about this particular graphic. I won't do this for every slide, just this one in particular. Okay, great. I'm going to move on. So we have some initial steps that we kind of said, these are where we're going to start. And the first step is to remove barriers. Right now, in your regulatory process, there is uncertainty. If I am going to invest my money as a private sector person, if I'm going to go purchase a home, I want certainty that when I buy this house, that I'm going to be able to occupy it. Let's just give that very simple example. Well, the same is true of developers. Their risk needs to be managed by a certain level of predictability. They want to know that when they go for the building permit and they put the lights on their building and the building is built, no one is going to come back to them in 2 weeks and say, I don't really like those lights. They're not great. Take those lights down and put up these other lights. Now, that's an example of something that was told to me in some of my interviews that actually happened to someone who developed something in Elyria. I think that's a really sad reflection of a process that has created a barrier that's likely not intended, but increases risk, reduces predictability, and reduces the potential for private investment in your community.
This is a form of public investment.
So one form of public investment is to take that barrier away by providing more certainty in that process, by streamlining it and making it more efficient for folks. Development approvals appoint people that are assigned to usher a project through the process and get the approvals and make sure everyone has given their comments before they go to construction. It's something you can do that's inexpensive. This isn't something where I'm talking about giving money, but it's just a regulatory barrier that can adjust the process and create certainty, which reduces that risk. You still will have your red gap, but you'll have reduced the time that that initial capital investment was outlaid. So we want to emphasize that this is how you can do improvements to your process itself and impact that private investment dollars in the public sector. The second, and we have 3 of these steps, is to target public sector investment. So I just talked about one type of public sector investment, which was not spending money, but an investment. Why does Elyria need to do this? Because we need to become better competitively. Heather talked about many of the great strengths, and we do see them. It's not like we came into this marketplace and didn't see potential. I told you there was demand. But what we see is that we have to improve overall the whole entire area, and we need to really target in and concentrate our resources. We looked at only 3 nodes in all of Elyria. You would say, well, that is concentrated. It's not. It's still too large. We need to concentrate even further. If you look at successful cities, whether they're Rust Belt cities, places like Allentown, Pennsylvania, where they had manufacturing, lost their base, and their economy shifted, what did they do? They targeted block by block. And when I say block, I mean 4 properties at a time. And that's been a year, but that targeted investment, that public sector assistance, even block by block, made it possible to grow further. Heather talked about this. It's the stone that you drop that has the ripple effect. And when you do that, let me just state again, you're able to get additional resources from other places. So the next and the third sort of key in our stool is to leverage other resources. Here in Elyria, we think that we should open up our eyes to this partnering concept. We're in a great region. We have great resources. We need to expand our thinking beyond just ourselves. It cannot be done alone. I can't say this enough. The city of Elyria has so many great assets, but it needs to leverage additional resources. There are many, and I have a slide that just shows a ton of funding sources and all the logos up there to give you the sense that you're not alone. Other cities and towns, they go to the state, they go to the county, they go to the region, and they get funding. They apply for stuff, they receive funding dollars, but they also receive support. And it's just lessons learned from other communities and other things like that. And we need to be doing a little bit more of that as well. So these are the 3 sectors that we had. And I think we always like to take a step back and pause. And we talked about this in our last presentation, and I want to reiterate it again. We had these 3 areas. At the top is the Midway District in green. Here we see the private sector is investing. We talked about the new hotel that's going on. We know that the city has already stepped in with the building there, the former restaurant. We know that the investment in the infrastructure that Terry will talk about is continuing forward. And I think it's more about guidance and shaping and helping this area and less about the public sector heavy-hitting investment that's going on there. When we come down to downtown here, the local government investment will help to shift the marketplace. This is perhaps one of the toughest markets because you have strengths, but you have a large area. This is where the private sector investment has that biggest gap. This is where that red bar is biggest, and this is where we need to sort of say, how can we shrink it? And then obviously out along Cleveland Street, Terry talked about this at the last meeting, so we'll go over it briefly today, but this investment is more about infrastructure and sort of planning for the future. That's going to take a longer time to sort of roll out. I'm going to turn it to Terry now to summarize those infrastructure upgrades, and then we'll be back to talk about those areas. Thank you.
Okay, so from the beginning, we've talked about infrastructure improvements, connectivity, beautification, particularly from the perspective of enhancing real estate markets. At our last meeting, when we were here together in February, there was some discussion about the fact that a lot of the ideas for improving your infrastructure are things that have been talked about in the community for a long time. So what we're trying to do with this work is both align those ideas to economic development outcomes and also provide a sort of step-by-step process. So for things that you really want to do, and truthfully, I mean, it's not going to be possible to do everything you can imagine that you'd like to do in the 3 districts, but you know, to prioritize the things that you think are the most important and the things that will have the most impact on the development and on the strength of the local economy. So just summarizing from our last meeting, looking at the previous thoroughfare study, as well as current traffic counts, it's pretty clear that there's sufficient roadway capacity. What I mean by that is sometimes we work on these studies and because a new development is coming, a road would need to be widened or an intersection would need to be changed in order to accommodate new development. Here in Elyria, the roadway system that you have is sufficient to handle the current demand and the projected demand for the sort of foreseeable future, for the implementation timeframe of this plan. So what we're suggesting in the connectivity and infrastructure recommendations are kind of clarifying the roadway network, and we'll talk about that, what that means, but switching some of the two-way streets to the one-way streets to two-way streets, improving the pedestrian environment, which is really important to what Heather and Abby are talking about. If you want to attract businesses downtown, it has to be possible not just for cars to move quickly through your downtown. We want to slow them down so people can see what's happening here. Not causing traffic jams, but just reducing that high-speed traffic, which also has the benefit of making the downtown area more appealing for pedestrians. Because right now, traffic moves fast, and pedestrians do not have the right-of-way ever. And we want to make sure that, you know, kind of pedestrians, bicyclists, transit riders, and people driving all have a way to access the businesses and opportunities in the downtown district. Now, at the last meeting, many of you filled out comment forms, and one of the questions and comments that came up quite frequently was like, you know, there's nothing downtown to walk to. You know, so focusing on pedestrian enhancements wasn't making sense to some of you because there weren't businesses and places to go. And I'm just going to be frank here, we've got a chicken and egg situation. I mean, you know, is there no place to walk to because it's so hard to walk? I mean, you have to kind of work on both of those fronts together, attracting new businesses downtown and then creating an environment where people want to come and where people want to linger. We know from the programming and events that happen downtown that people feel a connection to this place, and so when something's going on, if it's a special event, people will come downtown. And although, you know, people raise concerns about parking, people find a way to park and to experience downtown for those events. So what we're trying to do with the infrastructure recommendations is extend that period of time. So it's not just when there's a special event, but having downtown and the other two districts, you know, kind of fully functioning all the time. So the 4 areas that we worked on, I'll just go through very quickly because I know we've talked about these. Some of you may, this may be your first meeting, but I know others of you have been through all of these. One of the things we think is really important is that first impression that the community makes. So looking at those primary gateways where people are coming into Elyria and particularly coming into the downtown district, we want it to really be an expression of the identity of the community. So that's goal 1. Goal 2 is about defining space. There's a very intact downtown, as I'm sure you're all aware. There's a beautiful park system. They're also right next to each other, Ely Square and Cascade Park. So how can we create sort of a better condition so when people come downtown, they're able to see both the built downtown area, the historic downtown, and also the beautiful natural areas. When we talk about providing stitches, that's goal 3, is like where are those kind of key connections? If we can't provide a beautiful kind of streetscape on absolutely every street in the community, what are the important connections that people are making? So at least in those parts, we can target some investment to, again, kind of improve the walkability and the identity of the community. And then goal 4 is about fostering an experience. I mean, when you want to attract retail development, when you want to attract people to live downtown, it's not just about having the right building, the right parking, the right street width. It's also about the experience of the place. And this is something that Elyria has a competitive advantage like crazy over most other communities, is that it has a real kind of historic presence. And so what are all the ways we can make the downtown and the community more pedestrian friendly and convenient for the people who come here? Okay, we're going to switch into more specifics. We're going to talk about downtown. So as I mentioned, we're going to kind of go through the economic recommendations and the infrastructure recommendations for the downtown area specifically, and then we'll turn up the lights and we'll talk a little bit more about downtown.
Thanks, Terry. So I hope everybody here knows Elyria's downtown well enough to know that this is not the entirety of downtown that I've outlined in blue on my very sad, because I'm an economist, map. You will note that this is basically from west to east along Broad Street, and I captured a little bit of Ely Park. Heather and I looked at this very, very closely. We wanted to do all of downtown. We wanted to move here. We love downtown, but it's just not possible. So what we did was we said, let's find a targeted area, let's make those connections, and Terry talked about it. It's not to say that we don't love Kerstetter Way and how it connects to Cascade Park, but we're saying when you talk about targeting your investment, targeting the public sector limited resources that you have. And again, whether it's financial or not financial, this is the area that we want you to focus on. Now, this is sometimes controversial. Folks that are elected officials, they do not have a district this small, and there's only going to be one person representing it. And you're not going to get, the political will and the support unless the community gets behind this as well. But what's important here is that we're telling you very clearly that your demand is limited, your potential is limited, your resources are limited. Let's target ourselves, and here is the best area to target. Here is where focusing on getting buildings ready to go with high visibility and potential for some real options is going to make the biggest impact. This is your splash point, and this is where we want you to focus. And Heather's going to talk a little bit about the first signs of what that means in terms of the vibrant environment we want to create. But we're talking about business recruitment, we're talking about some wayfinding, which Terry will talk about, and conversion of streets, and enhancing things that she just mentioned, those connections and stitching it back together. But we're also talking about a strategy that has 4 broad action steps. And I'm going to show you here, this slide that you see right up here, we've done for each of the 3 areas. And for the areas, we show you where the area is on the map, we talk about its priority, we talk about the timing. And then we say, here are some of the funding sources. And we've given a great graphical representation, thanks to Jeff and other folks that work with Terry, who have been able to sort of say, this is the big ideas. But there is a 20-page document to follow, which will provide even more detail. But I think today what we want you to see is this is the concept. We list out the action steps, we list out the timing and the prioritization, we list out your partners, who's going to initiate it, and how we're going to move forward with the funding sources. So I'm going to stop and pause right here, and I'm going to talk to you about how each of these kind of work. Downtown is our biggest focus. So for downtown, we want to talk about creating spaces for pop-up retail and the vacant storefronts. We want to talk about building support for commercial district revitalization. We know you had a Main Street. We understand that that started to go forward. We're talking about shifting the focus here. We're talking about forming a downtown neighborhood association because the residential community needs a stronger voice in order to grow, to maintain clean and safe perceptions. We're talking about establishing an expedited permitting and licensing approval process specifically for this area, so you have that key point person pushing these projects through. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say to you, I showed you the graph, you know that there's a gap. Some of the ways to fill that gap, there are a whole bunch. We have a list, we have a process that talks about public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, and all these pieces. But what we did was we focused in on what was key for this area. So while there's a toolkit that's vast, for downtown, your best opportunities for capturing that money in the near term is to go after federal and Ohio historic preservation tax credits for specific buildings. That does tie the hands of your developers. That does lead them up to standards about historic redevelopment that is harder, but it's the best tool that you have in that particular project. You can also leverage that with what's called a new markets tax credit. That new markets tax credit is used very differently than other tax credits. It's applied to your debt. And in most projects that are done, it will provide relief for about 20 to 30%. 20 to 30% will help you fill that gap. Okay? So if you go after a new markets tax credit, you want to say, well, are there some available? Yes, there are. There are some available in Ohio. There are some available right here in your back door. There are folks, certified entities that have the capacity to do that today. What they need is a project that's ready to go. New markets tax credits only work with a project that's ready to move forward. So you need that project that's owned by an existing property owner who's invested and who has plans for redevelopment. And those do exist in the downtown, in particular along the targeted area we've talked about. There's a potential to take your community development block grant dollars and loan against future allocations and access future dollars and sort of flip the script on how those are being used. Some of your entitlement grant dollars need to be restricted to what they are used for today. You need to continue to do those investments, but you need to further leverage it. And sometimes, when I talk about these projects, folks are turning around saying to me, but that's only $10,000 here, but $10,000 here and $30,000 there will fill the gap, and you have to leverage more than one asset. I'm going to turn it over to Heather to talk about pop-up retail. Oh, no, all right, I guess it was still on Ohio Historic Tax Credits, but I think I've talked about that. So I'm going to switch to Heather for the pop-up part of this discussion, and then I'll be back.
In some ways, I feel like the outlier on this project, because everybody else wants to talk about how we should focus on downtown because it's important. I really believe that we should focus on downtown because it is the beginning and the end, as far as I'm concerned. And that might just be my retail voice speaking to you. But as far as I'm concerned, how the downtown goes, the rest of Elyria goes. And I mean that in terms of business attraction, not just for retail, but for commercial business, for industry, and even for new homeowners. When you speak of Elyria, when people come to your area to understand it better, to my mind, you take them to two things. You take them downtown, and you take them to the falls. And you show them the park, and you show them your beautiful homes. But first you take them downtown. And I can tell you right now that the way that a lot of those corporations and industries are making decisions has a lot to do with the type of living environment their employees will be part of. And we need to get downtown to a point where it is a gem that you're able to show off, really, to those people that are looking to invest in the community. And so the first thing that we need to do, to my mind, is to get the people of Elyria invested in downtown, not just from a dollars and regulatory approvals process, but from an emotional point of view. And I want people to identify with downtown, not just at the Apple Festival, but on a regular basis. I want it to become part of not just their customer pattern, but their consciousness. And in order to do that, we need to activate it in a way that people might be drawn there on a regular basis. Because as it stands today, I'm not sure what that would be. And so the first thing we're going to do is to revisit something that has been attempted here in Elyria before, but we're going to do it in a different way. And that is to institute some pop-up stores. If you're not familiar with the concept, a pop-up store is basically an opportunity for an entrepreneur to occupy space in which they maintain regular store hours and they sell goods during those, or provide services during those hours that are predictable, that people know that they can come to on a regular basis, and then in some cases might change on a regular basis. So if I came down to see Elyria's pop-up stores in March, I might want to come back in April or June, even if I didn't like what was there before, because it will be different this time. It is not only is it a reason to draw you to the downtown area to see something you haven't seen before, but it's a way to foster entrepreneurship. One of my favorite pop-up stores is this one out of Pittsburgh, which is Cool Cats, and it's the one that's down in the bottom corner of the slide. Cool Cats was basically a concept that was created by a woman who liked to paint cats on pottery. That was her whole shtick. And she opened this pop-up store that was nothing but her cats on plates and pictures and picture frames, and she created a pop-up store that was no more than 400 square feet. And she's now someplace that people seek out. The cat lover in you needs to have a Cool Cats plate. But she used to just do it in her basement for fun. The pop-up store program needs to help us identify who are the people in Elyria who might be our next retailers on Broad Street. And it needs to be something that provides them with the space in order to explore that rather than make the huge initial capital investment in creating a store of their own. I also wanted to emphasize with the picture at the top, this doesn't need to be a huge undertaking. A pop-up store can be as simple as a store that's built out and is safe, where you take a bunch of cinder blocks and planks and declare it a store. With that concept in mind, we can start to do things like offer temporary nail salon services. It basically becomes an incubator or testing ground for retailers that are looking for that opportunity. I'm going to emphasize in the economic development strategy that we look at creating a few of these. I was going to say several, but I'm really talking about 3 to 5 that to the extent possible we can make contiguous. Because what we're looking to do is to create that one solid block of experience that can then become part of a catalyst that grows. And I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about this in more detail afterwards, but I'm going to, for the sake of moving things forward, turn it back over to Terry to talk about the improvements to the infrastructure in downtown.
Thanks. So ultimately, I mean, the goal here for downtown is to have permanent businesses and the stability and such. But the excitement of the pop-up shop can lead to, I just do a quick case study here. This is Project Light Switch in the Collinwood neighborhood of Cleveland. The important thing is critical mass. You know, having one thing here or one thing there is nice if you want, you know, to kind of go to that one destination. But if you're trying to get some energy, some excitement, a little bit of buzz going about the downtown, you need to have multiple things going on at once. So these temporary shops can give way to something like this Project Light Switch initiative, which is a developer who decided to take 4 storefronts that were contiguous on Waterloo in Collinwood and get them going all at once. And so it's a restaurant, 2 restaurants, a coffee shop, and a gallery and a little bit of retail. It's hard to do, but timing is everything. And if you can get multiple things going on, suddenly it restores people's confidence in the downtown, and it gives people a sense that something is going on. And as you can see here, I mean, ultimately, the pop-up work was connected to a streetscape investment. So Waterloo has major infrastructure, beautification, connectivity, bringing back this idea that it's not about just economic development or just about beautification, but leveraging those two against each other. So the streetscape improvements to Waterloo were kind of complemented by some filling of the vacant storefronts. So when we talk about Broad Street, the idea here isn't that this is the only part of downtown that will be revitalized, but you start and you get something working in one area and then you grow it. And the reason we're focusing on Broad Street so heavily are 2 reasons. One is the architecture. You have a very intact line of historic buildings that creates a very strong impression. Even vacant, there's something about those storefronts that has a presence, that has an identity. But secondly, right on the other side of the bridge is Cascade Park, and the Metro Parks, as you know, are launching a master planning process for Cascade Park. So suddenly you have the historic downtown, the physical heart of the city, and then you have Cascade Park, the natural heart of the city. They're very near to each other, and we can get something happening here that can then grow and expand to other parts of the city. So what we're showing, here, use my pointer, this is Broad Street. Here. This is Kerstetter Way, linking under the bridge up to Cascade Park. So what we're suggesting is that the vacant storefronts along Broad Street would be the initial target for physical improvements and for attracting some businesses. Pop-up retail, permanent retail, whatever you can get going on in those businesses. Also important to recognize the value of the train station as part of the economic development picture for downtown. You know, in development circles, they refer to things like the train station, the transportation center, as a non-retail anchor, meaning that it attracts people and provides a solid anchor to the downtown. So leveraging the improvements that have already been made there and things that are planned for the transportation center, for the train station, is really an important thing, an important reason for why this part of the downtown is your best bet for moving forward. So here are the buildings where there are vacant storefronts now. We talk kind of generally about filling vacant storefronts, but we want to get more specific at this meeting. These are the ones where there are vacant storefronts. These are the buildings that have the potential for second floor residential or office development. As Abby and Heather mentioned, there is market demand suggested by the retail study that the upper levels of these spaces, some of them are already tenanted, but there are space in there to do some of the development. Now, as I'm sure you know, you wouldn't want to necessarily be the one resident of Broad Street downtown, but if you can get critical mass, if you can get, you know, a few buildings that have residential in them, suddenly you're activating the downtown in a new way, making the downtown more vital in the evenings as well, which is a comment that came up quite a bit at the last meeting. You know, downtown is busy and lively during the day, but after, you know, business hours, it becomes very quiet, very, you know, kind of very dead. And so if people are living downtown, it generates demand for businesses that also bring life to the downtown area in the evening. This is too small for you to see. Actually, without my glasses, it's too small for me to see. But ultimately, what we're looking at here, and I can just tell you, it's 7 storefronts that could be all filled. And again, like Project Light Switch, if you can get things going on in all 7 of those storefronts, or, you know, kind of several of them, it'll have more impact than just doing 1 or 2. Altogether, upper floors will create space for approximately, if you put all the buildings together, it's between 60 and 70 apartments and/or offices, depending on how you do the configuration. So this could be a little node of activity in the downtown that other things are built on. One of the questions that came up a lot at the last meeting was how you do parking. So what we did was we looked at where there is parking nearby now. For offices and retail uses, you want parking to be close, but it doesn't have to be immediately proximate, especially if we're able to slow down the traffic a little bit and improve the pedestrian amenities. People might be willing to walk a block or two to their destination. That said, when you do residential, people do want to be able to park their car close to where they live. They don't want to be walking a half mile with the groceries or what have you. So what we did was we counted all the spaces. There are some surface parking lots. There's some on-street parking, so the city could get creative about allowing resident parking on certain streets for people who live in the buildings. Could be by permit. So we counted the parking, and we looked at the buildings, and we think that there's a way that we can make this work. It really depends on the configuration. So figuring out from the developer's perspective, where the office space and where the apartments would go. But I think particularly, kind of for these buildings here, you've got 110 spaces right here. You've got 110 spaces here on the other side of the bridge. So that's quite a lot of capacity, figuring out how to configure it so it's appealing. You don't want to do market rate residential development and then find that people aren't willing to rent those units because the parking is inconvenient. So that needs to be negotiated, that needs to be designed. But having dedicated parking, there's enough space to do it. It's just, kind of working out the specific configuration. Okay, so the way that we can begin to look at the connection between Ely Square and Cascade Park, what are the steps that you would follow? At the last meeting, we talked about beautification of the railroad underpasses. Right now, the railroad bridge here that separates downtown and Broad Street from Cascade Park is pretty unwelcoming, unfriendly, it's dark. At the last meeting, a number of the comments that we got back had pertained to, people seem to like the idea of improving the bridges, but there was a lot of concern about how that would be maintained, and I fully agree. You don't want to invest in upgrading the underside of a bridge, making it beautiful, because if it's not maintained, it will be worse than not doing anything. So because there are a lot of bridges downtown, we looked at all of them, and the one thing we can tell you is if you're going to do just one, this would be a really good place to start because of that connection between the park and Ely Square. So the way it would begin is by having a conversation, a negotiation with Norfolk Southern. There's a step-by-step process. We've got the document. It's 48 pages long or something like that. But you can initiate aesthetic improvements to a bridge. You have to do it in tandem with the railroad. The good news is that Norfolk Southern even has a community foundation that they use to fund some of these kinds of projects. Depending on what you want to do there, if it's about creating an artwork under the bridge, there are funding at the national and state scale from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Ohio Arts Council that could be used to make these kinds of upgrades. These are just some examples. This is your bridge here on the right, and of course, this is an example from another community. What it actually turns out to be is sort of still to be determined, but just the idea that lighting and color can help make that experience of going under the bridge less foreboding. The other thing we talked about at the last meeting a bit was whether Kerstetter Way could become a sort of a pedestrian-only street some of the time or all of the time as a way of activating the storefronts, aligning it like this. There were some questions about whether that would work, and one of the things we can suggest to you, much like pop-up retail, test the capacity for future permanent retail. You could also do a sort of short-term experiment here on Kerstetter and this is the Better Block Initiative. Communities all around the country have been doing projects like this, where for a day or for a weekend, you try it out and you see if it works. And some of the problems or the concerns or the worries you might have now, you can experiment, and if it doesn't work, you don't do it permanently. You make a small, short-term investment. You do it around an event so that you get people there experiencing what Kerstetter Way could be like. The one on the left is a project we did in downtown Cleveland for Rockwell Avenue, where we actually kind of fabricated a dedicated bike facility and also had some outdoor space. All temporary. None of this was expensive, but it enabled people to experience the street right away in a different way. So just to summarize, in terms of downtown connections, the document, the plan that we produce will have a lot of recommendations, but the ones that we feel are the most important, open to discussion with you, are converting 2nd Street and 3rd Street from one-way streets to two-way, because that'll slow down traffic, it'll improve the visibility for retail uses that could be located in the downtown area, and it'll just make the pedestrian environment much more comfortable. For West Avenue and Middle Avenue, the possibility of what we call a road diet with bump outs and on-street parking, some landscaping would be another way to do this kind of traffic calming. Similar for Broad Street. If you're going to do some targeted streetscape investments, it would make sense to do them in conjunction with temporary retail, with the pop-up stores and other improvements that could happen along Broad Street. As far as converting the two-way to the one-way streets to two-way streets, there are funding sources available. The reason that you do one of these TLCI plans, the reason NOACA sponsors these is because they recognize Elyria as a regional priority. I hope you know that. I mean, the reason that this community received this funding is that at the regional level of NOACA, Elyria's downtown and Elyria's future is part of the regional priorities. And so what comes out of this process, if we have a strong recommendation to move forward with those street conversions, is that it could move forward into the surface transportation program to get engineering and funding. So the next step, I mean, right now what we've been doing is conceptual drawings, but if you really want to move forward with that, you would need to do the engineering work and the construction documents, get the funding in order to make that happen. And so this just sort of summarizes and shows it all together. And these are drawings that we looked at the last meeting, just to give you a sense of what that would look like. Really, another important thing that we just want to share is that you want to make sure that the connections between any development that is happening in the downtown are also things you focus on. So we know that there's housing being developed just west of the river, some senior housing. Sorry, the slide's not that clear. It's 0.4 of a mile, just a really quick 8 to 10 minute walk to Ely Square. So can we make that connection between the housing development, this is what it looks like today, so roadway, sidewalk, et cetera. Can we just do some really simple upgrades to widen the sidewalk, to perhaps add a little wayfinding signage so people who live in this new development feel comfortable making that fairly short walk into Ely Square. If we're going to try to get stuff going on around the downtown, anybody living downtown should be engaged in that. So it's lighting, it's wayfinding signage, it's a wider sidewalk. So the way that that could move forward is that through the Transportation for Livable Communities initiative, there's a new funding source that provides implementation dollars. So some of the smaller scale improvements, whether it's just directional signage or kind of some other pedestrian improvements, the city of Elyria could apply for those dollars and have a real quick win. Because one of the things we'd really love to see happen from this process is that some of the bigger recommendations are going to take a while. Certainly converting the one-way streets to two-way streets, this is a longer term kind of process. But some of the smaller scale wins are things that these smaller funding sources could do to get some excitement, to get some energy going in the community. Also kind of looking at the points of connectivity and where the wayfinding signage could go. It isn't just about the connection between the senior housing and Ely Square, but there are quite a few places in the downtown area where directional signage, pointing people to resources and amenities and also helping them locate parking would be really helpful. So the asterisks are showing where those could go. And then these are some of the images, in case you didn't see them at the last meeting, that show some of the crosswalks and landscaping and art elements that could really help stitch together the downtown. Directional signage. Okay, so at this point we're going to turn up the lights. We're right where we wanted to be. I know that we've got two other areas to cover, but most of the recommendations really fall within this downtown bucket. So we're going to turn up the lights. Jeff has the microphone, so if anyone has questions, someone has a question, then we will begin with that. Matt, would you mind actually going to that gentleman right there with a question?
Yeah. Where are we going?
He's got his hand raised right there.
Oh. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Super. I'm Bill Bird. I represent the Lorain County Historical Society. And at our initial meeting back in November, I asked if we can be intentional about developing downtown around our historic facades, and you said absolutely. However, I don't see a movement in that direction, the intentionality part of it. And I'm wondering about a recommendation for some type of local historic standards for this downtown area, because you mentioned it again today, right at the beginning, in your market analysis. 3 assets: natural beauty, history, and community. Okay? You've come back later and talked about trying to connect the beautiful parks to the historic downtown. But if we're not intentional about preserving those facades, then there isn't going to be an historic downtown.
Correct.
And I've had conversations with City Hall as recently as a month ago, and I understand part of the problem. You know, we're trying to get people to buy these buildings and take care of them. But if we put nothing out there, you know, just be thankful that they bought them, then the game is going to eventually be lost.
Agreed.
Now, I recognize that the typical person on the street thinks that the buildings where the wonderful giant and improved McDonald's is going to be are awful buildings. Well, I haven't been privileged to be inside of them, but I do know that there's something behind those false fronts that are awful, and you need to look beyond that. And if those buildings, in fact, do need to be sacrificed, building a giant McDonald's is not improving the historic downtown. Mm-hmm. Now, apparently that's a done deal, but we really, really need a recommendation to do something about the rest of that downtown. Another point is your three partners up there were Main Street and the city and the county. Okay. Well, if you really want to develop history in the downtown, I would suggest that possibly the Historical Society and or the city's Landmark Commission be viewed as a partner. Okay, that was a long commentary. I'd like to hear.
No, let me just say, so part of what I brought in the presentation today is just the list of top priority things, and one that burgeons to the top is the Ohio Preservation Tax Credit. Exactly, and I've forgotten your name, what you just mentioned. But the first thing that I want to say is there's a large matrix that's provided along with this, and it has a section just for downtown, and it has action items, and it reflects the Landmark Commission as a partner agency. At some point, if you start listing everybody, it becomes long-winded, and it's remiss that I didn't mention them when that slide came up about Ohio Historic Tax Preservation. It's in the notes section of my presentation, but I didn't mention it. But I think that's an important point. I would say yes, absolutely. What we find today is that there's a gap, and the standards that are in place at the state of Ohio level that reflect the federal tax credit from the Department of Interior that come through the rest of that and funnel through are sufficient standards if they're applied appropriately with the tax credit programs to preserve the nature of the historic buildings. It's not that we're suggesting you don't do that. In fact, that's one of our number ones on that list, and you saw it up there. We agree with you. We're saying prioritize that on this block right now. Because you can't do the whole area, and because some of the other historic buildings that I looked at have more of a mid-term place in the market context. So Terry will tell you that we had round and round discussions about the court building at the end of Eli Park, and we went around and around about putting it up there as one of the projects, and it's just not going to be ready fast enough compared to some of these other buildings. So it's really a choice, but the choice is still preservation, and the choice is to use that asset. I will give you an example. There's a community that I worked in that had preservation of buildings along. It had a ton of historic buildings. It had a very engaged Historic Preservation Commission, and they came to me, the city client that brought me in, and they said, we'd like to see redevelopment here, but we believe that the preservationists are holding us hostage. We believe that there's a battle. And I said, no, they're not. They're actually the ones that are holding you accountable and helping you move forward, because that's the asset that's driving the market. And when you looked at the buildings that had private investors who wanted to rehab them, they were the buildings that had historic nature. Why was that? That was because that's where the clientele and the tenants were coming from. So when we talked about the market potential, we talked about the authenticity of place. That's where our demand comes from. Those people who want to occupy those residential buildings, or the infill office demand, which is just kind of shifting around existing office users in downtown, are specifically interested in the authentic historic preservation of buildings and being in those spaces. Unfortunately, the gap is very real for those, so you need the preservation tax credit, and you need the support of the Landmark Commission to push it through. I would emphasize that I don't think you need to add additional standards. You just need to streamline those processes that are there and be shown as this big, supporter champion. I would love for you to just have your pom-poms out. That's what I see more as the role. Now, it is mentioned as specific matrix items, and we can talk about it a little more, one-on-one afterwards, and what we've written and what you would see as an additional piece to add to it. But I think the success of the downtown hinges on those assets, Cascade Park being one of them, and Ely Park, but also hinges predominantly on the historic structures in those buildings. So where there is a degradation of the existing structure, you are in high risk right now in losing some of those buildings. And so you need to move expeditiously. And I hope that sort of assuages a little bit of what I heard as some fear in what you were saying. And I completely understand that, because this is sort of a bit of a critical mass we're trying to dump into one place where there's the most historic assets. And as Terry showed, the most vacant storefronts. But we welcome more questions and more of a discussion, too. Let's talk about this.
I'm Christopher Smith with Lorraine County Community Development, and you mentioned earlier about the chicken and egg analogy. I was quite curious in terms of prioritizing, where does a community development center actually fit into all of this that can kind of facilitate some of these things, especially some of the things that the gentleman had mentioned. I'm actually from Cleveland. I commute to work for the county every day, and I've walked around downtown Elyria, and as a young professional found myself willing to actually live and locate downtown, if there were certain amenities that kind of appealed to me. So the pop-up shops, several of the things that you presented, have been going on in Cleveland for a long time, and it's very attractive. So, but Cleveland has several CDCs that help facilitate this growth. Where does that fit in the priority of all of this? Because I kind of see it as a very, very important piece to this puzzle.
That's a great question, and if everybody could hear that, he was talking about CDCs. I think what we want to just say is, and in our plan, again, one of the partner agencies, and it's on another set of slides, is that here in Elyria, you're very fortunate that you just have, and I know it's in its infancy, but you have a CIC. So you have the Community Investment Corporation set up. It's been set up properly. It has the right tools and the right ability, regulatory as well as legal ability to move forward, and one property, I believe, under its belt. And so I think that that is the major partner agency in particular for moving forward. It's not at the stage that it can do a complete land write-down of all of the properties that we're talking about here, which is some of the advanced kind of pieces you see from CDCs. But I think the CIC is really set up in a way that it's ready to move forward to that next step. And it's also very willing to partner with the Port Authority, with other entities, and even the philanthropic community to sort of leverage that resource like we've seen done in other cities and towns throughout the nation. And I don't know if the mayor wants to make a point to it. I mean, she did a great job setting that up. It was one of the things when I came in here, I looked at it. Is it set up properly? Is it going to have the teeth and then the ability to roll things forward? And it is. And that's a great asset.
Well, I agree with you. We needed an entity like that to be able to receive and redevelop property, and we have one now. We've taken in our first property. It just happens to be the former Mountain Jack's restaurant over by the mall. But we are looking at other properties. We're being very careful about the properties that we accept, because we do want to accept properties that have a redevelopment plan attached to them. There's a cost to receiving those properties, and while a CIC is established by the state legislature as a third-party arm independent of the city, it's still managed by the city, but it has community representation in it. And there's a cost to receiving properties. So right now, we're being very careful about the properties we receive. But we hope that we are able to build a cycle where, as we accept properties and put them out for in an RFP process, and they're purchased, that money will go back into the CIC, and we'll be able to build up the revenue to be able to move some of these very specific projects forward. The CIC can also accept and apply for federal and state funds that we're not currently the city wasn't currently eligible to receive. So that was another reason we did it. So we agree, and we are going to be aggressively using our CIC to help target some of these projects that we're talking about today.
Other questions? Do people have a response about this idea of concentrating initial energy and investment to that rather small kind of area of Broad Street? Does that make sense to you, or is that a concern for anyone? Yeah, we have two. Why don't you start in the back and then come forward?
What are the short-term plans for increasing mass transit in this area and connecting other areas? Because I understand that the Amtrak's coming to where the Greyhound is, and LCT is supposed to be operating out there. Me being from Cleveland as well, I see other neighborhoods like Broadway and like West 6 and whatnot, and even Euclid Avenue really come back due to the increased population density provided by mass transit. So that's something I want to know.
Yeah, we have a lot of interest in this transit center. I mean, particularly because, right now it may not seem like it's bringing a lot of people downtown, but the potential for connectivity, not just locally but regionally, that's represented by the train station is really impactful. So, I mean, it's one of the things to leverage. It's part of the reason why investing in Broad Street, so you're building that whole kind of line of energy anchored by the transit station is there. One of the things we didn't talk about too much, but we could certainly sort of fold into the plan, a lot of these transportation for livable communities projects also include enhancements to the transit waiting environment, because part of living downtown, we won't have to worry about parking so much if people are willing to ride transit. So you could have a household with one car, or a household that relies on buses and bicycles. Jeff, he has another kind of follow-up point.
I guess the point that I'm trying to get at is that there are smaller counties that have like a sales tax tie-in to their transit budget. And I mean, Elyria's, I don't believe it's quite, Lorain County's is quite tied in like that, but from the last meeting that I attended with Matt Lundy, it would only take $8.5 million, which is 4 times current what's needed to really beef it up to a point to where it's desirable to use. That's really what I'm trying to get at. What is happening to make that a reality?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is the problem, is that the mechanism for the transit will come through Lorain County. And so Lorain County's interest in an investment in changing that tax policy is something that the city itself can't have that big of an impact other than to say that we're in supportive of it. And I will say that there have been other cities that I've worked in throughout the nation where that was part of the problem that the city ran into, and anytime there was an opportunity for them to provide local matching support for a larger transportation initiative, they're willing to move forward. And I know from talking to the City Hall and the political officials here that political will exists, but you do have to continue to lobby as the city to the, to Lorain County and to Jim Cortez, and to say, we need this, we want this, these are the reasons, and to continue to pursue that, which I know your leadership has done. But you're absolutely right, there is a bit of a hands tied. I mean, I would love to do, a cigarette tax, I'd love to do lots of different tax things at the county level to help us here at Elyria, but there has to be a larger political will. I don't know, Mayor, if you want to address, I thought you might want to respond too.
Well, the good news is, I hope we're very close. There's been over $800,000 assembled to make improvements to the transportation center downtown. As you have probably read about, in order to return passenger rail to that center, there has to be work on the passenger rail platforms, and there has to be an ability for both freight and passenger to be run simultaneously. And that's going to require an expenditure of about $840,000 to $850,000. We have that money in place at this point. Excuse me, not 840. We're talking about, is that correct? 840? Do you have that? There's about $800,000 assembled. We're looking for another $8 million assembled. It's an right. I was kind of thinking to myself, what? No, it's the project is between $8 and $9 million. There's over $8 million assembled. We need another $400,000 to complete it, which is the local match. The city of Elyria has some in-kind match that we can provide to the project. So that's not so much the impediment. The concern, I think, at the county level is how to operate and maintain the facility once it's in place. And one of the things that we've been trying to emphasize is that we really want to begin to talk beyond just the initial investment to develop a business model that can be successful and look at other communities that have actually been able to do this. And I know in my conversation with our consultants, the transportation center in Elyria, it's been criticized in the local media as, you know, don't think it's a silver bullet, it's a waste of money. I disagree, and I disagree based on the experiences that other communities have had when they have been able to resurrect their transportation centers. You know, we're not just looking at returning Amtrak, but we're looking at a multimodal transportation center that can link Elyria to larger transportation improvements. I was just at a NOACA meeting 2 weeks ago, and the city of Cleveland, in preparation for, well, they would have done it anyway, but the timeline is being moved up for their transportation corridor improvements, including improvements to their passenger rail system, and they're moving it up in response to the Republican National Convention. And there's been substantial money earmarked through NOACA for this investment. And I'll tell you, for Elyria to be able to connect to that would be exponential. And so I think that's just all the more reason for us to continue to pursue this transportation improvement. Again, we've got most of the money assembled already for the building, our reconstruction of this, but it's the operating side of it. But I think it can be done, and maybe you can address that a little bit. There've been.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I mean, at the last meeting, we shared a few case studies of other communities whose downtowns were transformed by transit and transportation investments. Our facility, our organization is part of Kent State University, so we've witnessed this firsthand in the city of Kent. I mean, if you've been to downtown Kent, the amount of investment there is staggering, and a lot of it is private sector investment for sure, but the thing that anchored the whole project is the transportation center that's at the heart of it. Do you have more to add?
Yeah, I would just say that I think I showed it in the first presentation where I talked about transitioning your market from where your market's trajectory is today, and one of the things would be transit that would make that trajectory different and change that role. I have probably no less than 80 projects that I did that were focused on some type of multimodal, whether it was bus or something, a heavy commuter rail or something, you know, less. And in all of those instances, every time I run the financial numbers and did the back of the envelope financials, I was able to get better financing. I was able to get a better deal because the transit itself impacted the marketplace. So in all of those instances, many of them have public-private partnerships. I'll give you a great example. There was one where I came into an area that was between two large employment centers. So it itself was not a large employment center. It was similar to Elyria in terms of that nature. And they had limited development in a near where they had a major investment of infrastructure. And it turned out that the public play there, what the public needed to do was actually to extend a trunk line for sewer and then work with the public utility to expand the electrical service, and then they were able to leverage private investment. Part of it was just an agreement and a conversation with the utility that knew it would benefit from the investment that this transit would leverage, and part of it was an investment in the upgrades to the water line. But after those two investments, they were able to not only develop the one parcel that was immediately adjacent to that transit multimodal facility, but they were able to flip 2 more projects, which are under construction today. They were able to use tax increment financing dollars to fund the water infrastructure, which the locality did not have the money to do up front, and then they were able to get a larger scale development. They also reduced some of their regulatory restrictions that they had in place that they thought were, no big deal. Turned out to be they were a big deal. And in those instances, they not only doubled but tripled the capacity of what the development was. They created a critical mass and they brought them in. This is not like an urban area. This wasn't in a downtown hip place. This wasn't really, cool transit. This was commuter rail. This was bus service. But it was just a few additional public sector investments that turned the tide there, and the marketplace changed. And I will tell you that it sounds like a silly thing. It sounds like a simple, silly thing. It took time. It took 36 months to make those connections and relationships and change the attitude about that. But those parcels today have a bigger development value, and the property values in and around within a quarter mile to a half mile of where that occurred have increased by 10%. So it's not a hard thing to show us.
So does anybody have things about downtown that they'd like to talk about? Yes.
Thank you. You're talking about the pop-up shops for downtown. Are you expecting the people of Elyria or Lorain County to come up with the ideas, or are you going out and trying to get people to come in and bring ideas and the pop-up shops in so that you have a new influx of people?
So there's a couple of ways that we can do it, and nothing has been decided yet. I'd be very interested in hearing your opinion on your question that you've asked. But the way that we've seen this succeed with other communities that we've worked with is that they would extend it to, based on the size of their city, the residents of the city or the people of the county, with the idea being that what they're really trying to do is to find the next level or the next influx of local entrepreneurs. That might even be people who have toyed with the idea before of opening a retail store, but just don't have a spare $100,000 lying around to go ahead and take that risk, full throttle. So they're looking for an opportunity to test it, really, to see if it's something that would make sense from a financial standpoint. A lot of lenders now are willing to take things like 3 months of receipts from your pop-up store when they're considering whether or not to give you a small business loan. So it's really, it seems like a silly idea, but it has so many practical applications in so many different ways. I would be very interested in kind of, first of all, seeing what the people of Elyria have to offer, and then looking at expanding that as opportunities evolve. But for, something I didn't say because it sounds kind of negative, but I'm going to go ahead and say it now, is we're not getting Barnes & Noble and Starbucks in downtown Elyria. We're going to get great local and regional tenants. And the first people we'll get are the locals, because they're willing to take the highest amount of risk, because they tie their experience to how downtown goes. They have an emotional investment in addition to a financial one. And so my instinct would be to keep it as local as possible. And it's actually one of the things that communities really rally around, that I've seen be like a real community spirit raiser, for no other turn of phrase, is to see what people are doing, in their workroom that, people didn't know that the man down the street builds furniture, or, that somebody has a pottery wheel in their basement, you might be really surprised at what comes forward. I think it would be really neat to test it.
Just jump in real quickly
Sure.
and say, you have 2 great student populations nearby.
Yes.
You've got Lorain County Community College and you've got Oberlin. Students are great at this. At Kent State, there's a fashion school, and the students started a little pop-up fashion shop that's now a permanent shop in the kind of downtown district. In Pittsburgh, there were a group of architecture students who were reacting against the giant IKEA, so they created their own furniture shop called Schmikea. And it was, it was kind of dumb, but,
I think it sounds awesome.
but it was really funny, and people came to see it because it was only open for a very short period of time, a week or 2, but it was, it created a little bit of excitement, and that's kind of key. So students, don't underestimate the value that they bring.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
One thing I would like to add too is the city's been in conversation with Oberlin College, and also Lorraine County Community College, and both are interested. In fact, Oberlin has a senior project whereby their seniors have to commit to a real-life entrepreneurial experience. And they are interested. What's been holding us back is they need ready space. They need ready maker space. So one of the first things we're going to do to try to help facilitate this is, we did try to facilitate pop-up shops earlier, but the dilemma was that we did not have ready space. So we do have some investors in downtown Elyria that have purchased buildings recently, and we are working with them to try to create some ready space with some, hopefully, public assistance and some of these funding methods. But if we can create this ready space, I think we can find the entrepreneurial spirit for this makers movement, because it'll come either from students, or we do have a little experiment right now, as you know, with the Art Depot. And that was an experiment with the Lorraine Arts Council. That has evolved now, and the artists have gone on their own, and because of that experience, have opened up their own shop in that same space. And so we're hopeful that that will continue to happen. But I think it can happen locally. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Since we're talking about the pop-up shops, for communities that have used them, is there a time frame that the pop-up shops remain? Is there a limitation for how long they remain in the community?
So we usually think about them in terms of a 3-month time span, with the option that at the end of that 3-month period, if somebody's had a real run of success, we don't necessarily want to throw them out just because 3 months is up, where they could file for an extension for an additional 3 months. And really the idea would be that ideally at the end of a year, you would have 3 to 5 shops that are legitimate. And that through the process you've kind of weeded out the hobbyist, I guess, for lack of a better term, and really look to graduate those pop-up shops then into permanent space.
Do we have another question? There we go.
Regarding the 2nd and 3rd Street two-way traffic, was that just between east and west, or was it going to go farther west than that?
Let me show you the diagram. There it is. I mean, right now what we're showing is between East and Chestnut. There would have to be the full-blown engineering study. TLCI process is really more conceptual. But the idea is that within the downtown district, you want people to be able to go in both directions, because if they're driving and they see something they're interested in and can't get there, they may just keep going. Also, I mean, one-way streets are designed to move traffic quickly from here to there, through, rather than encouraging people to stop. So we really are focusing, like everything on this plan, on a very tight area, a small space, because if you can see what happens and get it working in that area, then we get that kind of impact that we're reaching for.
I had one other question, maybe more for the mayor. One of the suggestions was a downtown association. Does Main Street function anymore, or?
Yeah, I think I turned over the slides a little too early, because there were some slides back here that and Heather said that, and I didn't realize that I'd done that. So one of the things in the very beginning when we talked about downtown was building a downtown neighborhood association. So right now there's so few people living in downtown, and you're not the only city by far that we've gone into where there's been 12 people living down there. It's fine. But if you establish a neighborhood association, then that residential component, because we know that there's demand for the authentic place along Broad Street, and there are folks here who have property owners who are actually renting to residential in your downtown now, and they just talk about the lack of a sense of community. So it might be a neighborhood association with 20 people when you start out, but it's important to kind of put that organization together. And again, it's not a costly initiative or anything. We're talking about money. We're just talking about sort of bringing folks together, having them sit down. I live here too. Shared experiences, shared positive stories, and a way to sort of build that cohesiveness of that. There is a Main Street organization that is currently in place that was defunct and has come back, but I think what the bigger deal is that we've seen other mechanisms that are more appropriate for a redevelopment effort, which is really the CIC, the Community Investment Corporation. When we came in as consultants, one of the first things we did was to review how that was set up, what kind of rules were in place for it, what kind of teeth it had. Could it really go after some of the funding mechanisms that we think are appropriate for downtown? And yes, it has been, and yes, it already has one property, and I mentioned that previously about the restaurant. The idea here is that you now have an entity, a CIC, that will be able to go after funding sources and do more than you would with a typical Main Street program. And we see it kind of in a dire position where this really needs to happen. And I think the mayor can talk about the ability of the CIC to step into that role. I think she wants the... I'm like trying to get Jeff to let her talk about it too.
Well, we knew there was a gap, and Main Street right now, it has been largely activity focused, and that is needed. But the gap was there was not a mechanism to receive and organize and redevelop properties. And so the city did step in, and in 2014, we created the new Elyria Community Improvement Corporation, and that was a mechanism created by the state legislature a number of years ago. Many communities have it, but it acts as an arm of the city, but almost as a third party. It gives us a little buffer for liability. The city does have representation on the Community Improvement Corporation. I'm the president. We've got other representatives involved with the city. We've also got some community representatives involved. But what that does is it allows us to receive federal and state funding that we might not otherwise be eligible for. It also allows us to receive properties in the form of donations where we can provide a tax write-off to the donor and offer it up for redevelopment, which we never had in the past. So our first project was the former Mountain Jacks property has been donated to the new Community Improvement Corporation, and that property will be offered out in terms of an RFP process for redevelopment. And we've also got some other buildings in the queue. We're not accepting them unless there's a redevelopment plan attached to them, because there is a cost to to receive buildings. But we do see the CIC as a very important mechanism in downtown revitalization, as well as some other pockets in the community, Midway area as well.
Right. And I think what's important here to mention is that the listing up here on the board with the funding mechanisms talks about those that are specific for this node as compared to those for throughout the entire area. We have a larger matrix with specific action items and funding sources associated with each action item. But here tonight, we're trying to target in and talk about specific to the goals that we have time to cover tonight and those specific funding sources. So Terry was saying, here's a project, here's a funding source, and the mayor's talking about here's an entity that exists that we can attract additional funding sources to do some of the things we're talking about tonight. So we're just trying to make those connections so that you understand it's not just one item that we're giving you, one piece of the puzzle, but we're giving you kind of the whole menu. There was a question from the guy in the blue vest.
I have a question. There is a perception, and I underscore the word perception, that at various times of the day or night, the city is not particularly safe, the downtown area. How does this plan address that, to erode that perception and to attract people into the area to support these new businesses?
Well, I mean, the good news is that we've talked to the mayor about the safety issue, and I can't remember the specific statistic, but downtown is much safer today than it was even a very short time ago. So that story needs to be told. The second thing is that the way you make people feel comfortable and safe downtown is for them to see other people. So something has to spark it. Having more people living downtown, when we first heard of the senior development happening, we're like, fantastic. We know that some people were nervous about senior housing downtown because downtown isn't safe, but downtown will never be safe if there aren't more people occupying it. So I think the fact that there's senior housing and there's opportunity to do a cluster of development, along Broad Street, these are two kind of things that give you anchor points in the downtown. The other ways that the plan addresses it is, one of the things that makes downtown downtown unsafe, frankly, is not maybe what you're thinking of, but it's the fact that you could get easily run over by a car, which honestly we experienced when we were out taking pictures. Drivers didn't like us crossing the street too much. So kind of, improving the pedestrian environment will encourage more people to walk. Even before there are businesses filling every storefront, more people will stroll in the downtown because it's just such a nice place. I think more events like the Apple Festival, any kind of events and programming, the food truck activity, all of this contributes. People come downtown, have a positive experience, and that perception begins to change.
Yeah, part of the thing is the draw, and I think of things that I like to do in places I go to do it. I like ice cream. Well, there isn't an ice cream store. You can't get ice cream, particularly downtown. I like to go to the movie. Well, there isn't a movie. They have one in Amherst. They have one in Oberlin. If we had some of these things that would draw, a nice restaurant, again, we had one at one point in time, but that's gone. But hopefully something's coming back. But those kinds of things which come about, and also with the downtown, if you have neighborhood downtown, then those people use those. And maybe, there are other little stores that fit in those niches for the needs. I think not, just something you'd like to do, but needs that people have, and fill those.
So I realize it wasn't actually a question, but a good observation. Part of what we really were trying to do with this approach was to use the market analysis as part of the strategy that associated with it. And one of the things that happens in retail environments, and I think something that's really important to know, is that by and large, retailers are the most skittish of every type of real estate investor. You could put them all in one room, and they're the ones that want the most assurance that things are going to go okay. Partially, if you think about it, for a lot of them, opening one store is putting their entire life savings on the line. And I speak from personal experience because my family is in retail, and I've already been told there's no inheritance coming my way. However, what we need to focus on with Elyria is how do we start to build on retail demand that's already here. And some of the things that you mentioned are some of the hardest types of retail to attract, and are the ones that have the most options in a larger environment. I would love to see an ice cream store here. I think it'd be an awesome pop-up shop opportunity. I'm hoping that Oberlin has an agriculture department with an active dairy component that will somehow see the opportunity within Elyria. But those bigger things that kind of create the destination that we think of with retail, that's going to take growth and building. And something that you're going to see inherent throughout this entire report is that we're talking about building markets or market creation. And so we're going to intentionally start smaller. And the idea with starting smaller is that it won't require as many people, as much money, and as much overwhelming effort to get that started. And that you just keep building on that until one day you are able to support a movie theater downtown. And the sit-down nice restaurant is not, there's not one but several. But we have to start from a very kind of low barrier to entry point, because we have to not only build them a market but prove it to those people that have more opportunities and are less willing to take on risk. But thank you for your comments.
So we should, oh, is there no, yes. Let's do, yes, please.
I live in South Elyria, and there's a lot of renters there and a lot of new families that don't have cars, and I see them walking all the time. And all you need is a grocery store for them to go to, and then that'll bring a lot of business downtown, and I keep saying that nobody does anything. Is that so improbable?
Yeah, okay. Great question. You guys have really big retail ambitions. Grocery store and a movie theater are going to be two of the hardest sells in this environment. And you need to think about it in terms of context. So if I'm a grocer and I need to put a 55,000 square foot square somewhere in Elyria, and I go a mile and a half east, and I have a field to pick from, or I could figure out how to fit it in downtown, my instinct is going to be to go for the field, because like I said, risk averse, don't like change. However, there are a lot of retail concepts that are coming online that are starting to think about how do you shrink that into a smaller box. And so the regional grocers that you would think about in that framework, I think, are viable alternatives. What Terry's going to talk about in the next session or the one after that is improving the transportation system throughout the area. And I think that the ability to not have everything at your front door, but to have access to everything, whether you have a car or not, is going to become a really important part of this story. But, you know, I think it's important for us to think about downtown in terms of what could a retailer do here that they can't do in the field a mile and a half away? And that's where you start to talk about, you know, the experience-based retailers that really want to be part of the idea of being part of a historic Main Street environment is part of their brand identity. So it might be the coffee shop, or it might be the sit-down restaurant, or it's the ice cream shop, or it's you know, a shoe store that like really focuses in on repair. Like, you know, it's all, you're not even, it's not necessarily that you're going back in time to pick out your retailers. It's really that they're very conscious not just of what happens within their four walls, but what happens as part of their environment. So I love the question. I just think we have to think about it from a different perspective.
I think we're going to move on to Midway.
Yeah, we'll stay for questions after, but just to kind
Anyways.
of, in the interest of keeping everything on.
So Midway is interesting in that I think previously when we talked about Midway, everybody talks about Midway Mall, and Heather's made it clear today, and I think we need to all start thinking about the Midway District. But what we said is, and if you, again, look at this map, you'll see we're not talking about the mall. We're talking about east of the mall, and in fact, we're talking about the Walmart site and moving east over along kind of what I consider the drop-off to look down to our beautiful potential new development or former golf course. I don't know how to position that. We'll see what happens. We'll see if he does what he says he's going to do. But I think what we're talking about here is kickstarting private reinvestment. I know there's been a sale of the Walmart piece of property, but what I want to focus in on here today is that there was demand, and the demand here was for the commercial side for flex office product. This is a product that you'll see where nowadays, if I go out to get financing for this, I can get it. I can get financing for flex industrial product. It's 1 to 2 stories. I can take an older strips commercial center as I'm sort of right-sizing that retail, and I can invest and I can make money today doing that. The gap that I showed before, that big red gap, it is much, much, much smaller here, almost down to nothing. If you get the land for the right price, you can make that deal, you can fill that space because you have access to both of the interstates with 80 and 90 there. This is a good place, this is a good location. What needs to be done is that because that market's on the verge, and it's just like we talked about with the hotel market, we want to sort of support them, but not worry too much about the lodging industry. We want to support this office demand, this flex office demand, but we want to remember that we have to be intentional. And we want to remember that there's a longer term play here. And because we have this huge asset in that we have this green resource right to the east, and we have metro parks here, we want to think about the potential for residential. Now, in the same way that your Hampton Inn came in and took a segment of the market and said, I'm going to go for something that's not here today. That is exactly what I'm talking about with your residential. I'm talking about going for something today that's not here. I'm talking about moving us up. If you look at your apartment and rental properties in this area, they are not sort of hitting that higher edge. You're not sort of getting that. Sort of there's a tip of the marketplace that's left untouched, and that's where we want to focus the potential here. So while we know that the ownership has changed hands, we're lucky that StreetSense has a relationship and knows kind of the ownership shifting there in that retail world. We want to look at the back end of the property, and I think Terry put this piece up here, and think about residential, which is demonstrated in yellow here along the back end, as a potential in terms of like what you consider a strategy to hold that land to be that second phase of development. So today, you put in the red up top would be one building, one 30,000 square foot industrial flex kind of funky building that's an office user. And you'd put that piece in, and then maybe you do the second red building, or maybe you really just do the first and the third, depending upon parking. And then you shift the residential nature. So you can see sort of how it went from strip commercials, surface lots, we keep those surface lots, we keep that front piece in, we put a little green to sort of spruce it up, but we really pull back the residential and provide a product that's not there. And again, we're adjacent to the mall, so we know that the mall will shift and evolve and change, and Heather can talk about that, but we're focusing on the locational benefit between these two highways, take that office market, and then help this private sector investment by being the local entity that says, from a leadership perspective, and it can be just as simple as saying, here's the market report we have. See the support? Maybe reconsider what you're doing. Maybe position your building so that in 3 years, your next investment is this. Maybe joint venture with a multifamily developer, something you might not have considered previously, because we know there's support and the financing is out there for these products today. And then that's the key. And I didn't know, Heather, do you want to? Okay, so here we're talking about land assembly and creating new development sites and enhancing sort of the connections to the park system. I will say that I'm a big believer in park system. I'm a big believer in making arrangements and building on that asset and concessions. I've seen it happen several times over. I've done a bunch of real estate work specifically for parks, departments of parks in different cities and different counties. And oftentimes what I'm telling them is that, you know, there's an asset here that needs to be played upon by the private sector and a contribution. This is no different because you do have this tremendous resource. Here, I think the financing mechanisms are a little different. I talked about a potential for a tax increment financing district and making those connections and shifting the strip commercial. So this is just the slide that talks about the myriad of different ways to fund all of the things that we talked about. But one of the key things that we're looking at here is that there are funding in place that you could do smaller components of this whole development with all of these different funding sources. So on some instances, like Community Foundation of Lorain County would provide a grant just for some component of that streetscape investment. So you come back here and some portion of this green along the frontage that you want to see here, well, that's going to be hard for the private developer to invest in, and they've got the ongoing operating costs. But if you put your money in that upfront piece, applied to Lorain County Community Foundation on behalf of the developer in a partnership setting, you get that piece, he's willing to preserve that for you, and then, you know, you've built something for the future without sort of engaging a ton of resources. So it's just an example. So when we look at the former Walmart site and the strip commercial properties surrounding this little triangle of activity, we want to work with the city and the county and whoever that owner becomes, but we want to look at, there's a potential to either donate it to the CIC or just participate, like I talked about, as one of the team members who's applying for funding as the city of Elyria or as the CIC to help them access ways to preserve this land into a bigger piece. What we don't want to see is an opportunity where the redevelopment of that parcel shifts back to what we've already seen is unsuccessful and doesn't tap the way the market's trending. We think the investment from the hospitality industry has shown that that locational advantage is something to be tapped. So we want to work with those end users to redevelop the site, and sometimes that working with them does not always mean financial support. In particular, in the Midway District, it may not need to be. However, we have left the opportunity open for it to go to the CIC if you wanted to sort of invest that way. This is a high priority, but it's a long-term build-out. The funding mechanisms here in terms of the Turnpike Mitigation Program and the public financing and private investment you're going to need to do takes a while to happen. Tax increment financing, like I talked about in the example I just previously mentioned, it takes a while, but it's about floating that bond now because you know that marketplace will be there and the revenue will come in to support it, not spending tax dollars that you don't have or resources you don't have, and that's why that resource would be one we would highlight. So for Midway Mall, we're talking about reducing the retail square footage in this entire area and clarifying a street grid, and I think Terry's going to talk about this sort of photo that she has, and these are the steps to get to it.
Yeah, we'll just be quick about it. We know that the development, the retail in the Midway Mall area is going to change. How it's going to change, we don't know, but we know that there's more retail square footage based on the market assessment than the community and the region can support. So how it transitions over the next, you know, kind of the next several years, the next many years, is still to be determined. The important part of this plan is establishing a framework so as it does change, it changes in a way that you want to see. So definitely will lead to reduced reduced square footage of retail, but again, smaller, better, kind of retail would remain. Clarifying the street grid, because frankly, right now, it's pretty confusing if you don't know the area pretty well to get to the vendors, to the stores you want to get to. The idea that the metro parks provide an asset that's largely ignored at the Midway District, if we're going to be introducing rental, residential kind of uses up there, having that amenity of a bicycle and pedestrian connection into the metro parks would be key to the marketability of that. The mix of uses ultimately, kind of could include residential, retail, of course, and some office. The importance of aligning some of the major retailers so that there's high visibility, both from 57, because that's where your local traffic will come, but also kind of the signage that enables people to see those businesses better from the turnpike. Regarding kind of the question of land assembly and connections into the metro parks, we don't really have time to go into the details of all the funding sources out there. The important things of the slide that Abby showed and this one is to know that there are ways of paying for this. It's not like going to the city and trying to extract resources that you don't have. But when you have a plan and things that you're trying to accomplish, there's funding from a variety of sources, state and federal, that can help make this connectivity happen. Overall, this is a concept plan for how Midway Mall could develop. We talked about this a little bit at the last meeting, but it's about, kind of reconfiguring the footprint of the mall itself, of introducing some of these other uses, particularly residential and flex office space, and then improving the street grid so that, traffic can move to and through the businesses in this area. In the interest of time, and since we're almost done, I think we'll just kind of quickly show some of the Cleveland Street ideas very briefly, and then we'll turn up for a discussion of Cleveland Street and Midway together. So, Abby, do you want to take? No. Okay. Investing in the infrastructure upgrades. One of the things we talked about at the last meeting was the possibility of converting the four lanes of traffic on Cleveland Street to 2 lanes, one in each direction with a turning lane. There was some concerns that we heard both verbally and also in the comments that this would impede traffic flow. There would have to be a full-blown traffic study of that idea, but the preliminary work that came out of the thoroughfare study and our work suggests that it wouldn't necessarily slow down traffic. In fact, it would most likely reduce accidents because all the left turn movements then would be concentrated in a turning lane, and the 2 other lanes would, be the through lanes. The other thing that would give you is a little more space in the right-of-way, which could be either used for bike lanes or to widen the tree lawn for beautification. So how that would move forward, it's working with NOACA to see if transportation dollars and CMAQ funds, that's congestion and mitigation air quality funds, could be assembled for this project. And also kind of doing a full-blown traffic study to make sure that what you get out of this investment would be improved traffic flow, increased safety. And so this diagram shows the existing condition, and here's how it could change. Like the nice thing about it from a beautification standpoint is a little bit wider tree lawn would enable us to get like a continuous row of trees, which would have a tremendous impact on the appearance of the street. Also some signage to remind people that Cleveland Street isn't a separate destination, but something that is connected and part of the overall retail infrastructure for the community. Also, the important thing is about attracting future businesses to these sites. Right now, Cleveland Street is, for the most part, very well occupied, but as businesses leave and transition, it's important to have a plan to get new business in to fill the space. And of course, the Bendix facility is a big question mark for everyone, so figuring out what the future uses are for that site, and also doing whatever we can at this point to make the frontage of that property as appealing as possible to attract a developer, a new user, new tenants to use that space. So what we're suggesting here is that particularly on the stretch between, that goes from along Cleveland Street that goes to JFK Parkway, that could be the area where we enhance the streetscape with trees, again, doing this conversion to the 2-lane with the turning lane. In the second section here in front of Bendix, it might be an even more, kind of intensive streetscape. So you're creating this development frontage so that ultimately a new development plan could be created for the Bendix facility. Okay, so I told you that would be short. We're going to turn up the lights and see if you have any comments, additions, concerns, questions about Cleveland Street and the Midway District. Any comments, questions? Does this make sense? I mean, you know, again, it's about, you know, you've got these two larger areas, and we can't, you know, kind of comprehensively address everything at once, so a little bit of targeting. So the one side of the Midway District at the eastern end would be a good place to start because you could get something going and something working there. Similarly, for Cleveland Street, targeting the resources to a development opportunity that's on the horizon in the Bendix property. We could ask, any questions overall? Any comments? Any things? Okay, so we've gone through these three districts. Are there any things that, you know, we should have addressed in this planning process that you're not seeing here? Because, you know, yes, question in the back.
Early in this discussion, you spoke of the lack of human potential here in the community. And I guess something that is different out here as opposed to Cleveland is Cleveland has much denser housing. You know, the multi-unit housing, multi-family housing. Part of the lack of that out here, you know, the single-family homes, people aren't really looking for that right now, even though there is pent-up demand. How, part of that ties into the brain drain, you know, like Lorraine County, people go to the college, get their education, move out of town. What can you, what are some of the things that are going to be done to help curb that, to bring the brain power back to the community so some of these things can be addressed locally instead of having to go to Maryland?
Right.
Or Kent.
What we see is not only businesses, but people that will leave because they're craving a creation of place. They're creating a place-based solution. So the downtown itself is that place. It just needs a little help to bolster it. That's exactly kind of part of the market problem and the perception and why we targeted it, because the denser and that getting that critical mass is going to require an effort that's nothing that you've undertaken today. It's going to require an additional effort and an additional emphasis on this creation of place. So why Terry's talking so much about the parks and the connection to the bikes is that we know that the folks in the millennial group, as well as the other folks that are baby boomers, you know, every day that you know, a new set of 10,000 people become 65 and older. What they crave is a vibrant, walkable community. What they crave is access to services that they can get to, and what Terry's talked about are enhancements that connect those connections. When we looked at the marketplace, we did see demand for these things, and we did see some potential, but like we talked about, the housing is so affordable here. If your choice is to rent an older apartment that was built 20 or 15 years ago, or get a whole house, you're going to go for the whole house because you can even rent it, or you know, your mortgage payment is commensurate. So what you need to do is to infuse that new product in very key places. And so that demand, although it exists, and we talked about the access to the financing is there, we're only talking about placing it in that triangle at the Midway District, and we're only talking about infill along Broad Street, because we really see that the only way to do that is as close as you can get to those assets, the natural resources and the natural beauty, to get to the historic buildings in the authentic place, or to get to the interstates. And so that's, and the train station. So those things are why we're targeting it there. I hope that sort of addressed it, but I'm guessing that's going to spark some interest from some other folks out here. If you had questions about why don't we have more office, or how about a hotel in downtown, or other questions about the funding sources, now's the time. Don't be shy. Feel free to ask.
So that Jeff doesn't have to run on the other side. Speed it up, Jeff.
On the Cleveland Street project, the one I stay off of Cleveland as much as possible because of the Abbey Road connection, because it's too bottlenecked up there, and traffic actually gets backed up on the 57 there at the JFK Parkway, and it just seems like you ought to be able to cut that straight through, you know, like move Life Care over to the old Colonel joint and, you know, just cut through, because that's a bad bottleneck. The lights are too fast, and I mean, it's a bad bottleneck right there.
That's an interesting suggestion. We haven't looked at that, so thank you for raising that. Oh.
The thoroughfare plan suggests that particular. The thoroughfare plan actually looks at that particular intersection and suggests that exactly what you're sort of suggesting, that can be realigned, so it's more of a direct four-way connection. So that is it. That is in part of the recommendations. Oh, okay.
And don't forget that you can also like make notes on the comment sheets if you'd rather kind of share with it that way. Yes, please.
I own about 400 feet of commercial property on Cleveland Street. I have an office there, and I watch the traffic patterns all day long. Turning Cleveland Street into 3 lanes is a major disaster. It can't work. I understand how you want to create pedestrian interest to stop and go slow. Today, there are just too many individual homes on Cleveland Street, and to turn that road into 3 lanes, people will avoid going on that road. Okay, I'm not done yet. Please,
Okay.
if I can finish.
Please.
Why? It's just not an opinion. The reasons are, number one, FedEx trucks, delivery trucks stop on the curb lane whenever they feel like it, and if you're only 3 lanes where the car's going to go. Number two, City of Elyria's hospital is probably one of our greatest resources, and emergency trucks are going up and down that road all day long. If the gentleman says Abbey Road is a bad intersection, it's terrible. And I can just imagine what's going to happen if you have 3 lanes and emergency trucks trying to go down that street. Okay? Another reason, people are turning left and right on both sides of the streets. I mean, it's just going to be backed up. Instead of enhancing Cleveland Street, you're going to make it a headache for people to want to go there. Number 4, the curb lanes are just full of potholes. Oftentimes, I have been stopped once for switching lanes at midnight because I didn't want to damage my car because of the size of that pothole in front of Stewart's. Okay? I'm almost done. Most of the thoroughfares coming in or leaving the city of Elyria are 4 lanes. They're 4 lanes. Gulf Road, Middle Avenue, the boulevard that goes out to the west side of town, I don't know what that's called. They're 4, and to go to 3 is mind-boggling, especially when North Ridgeville is spending a ton of money to go from 3 lanes to 4 lanes. I'm sorry, I hate to be the messenger of bad news, but that's my opinion. It's a disaster.
Okay, if I can just make one point of clarification, though, from where you started. The idea is not to slow the traffic down for pedestrians along Cleveland Street. That's the goal for Broad Street. That's the goal for the downtown district. That's the reason why we're turning or proposing to turn those one-way streets into 2-way streets. On Cleveland Street, it really is about flow and about safety, because when you talk about a lot of turning movements, having a dedicated left turn lane actually kind of reduces the number of times people need to switch lanes to get around, because you're driving along, you think you're going straight, and suddenly somebody's got the left turn signal on. That's really what it's about and where it came from. So it isn't about slowing the cars down. It really is about trying to maintain flow. I totally get especially this question about delivery trucks. I mean, if there are in fact a lot of FedEx trucks that are parking in that lane and we have only 1 through lane in each direction, that is a huge problem, because at that point the cars are going to have to be swerving into the left turn lane in order to get around them. So that's something, I mean, please note that any of these things would never happen without a full-blown engineering study. We're urban designers and planners. We're kind of working with the thoroughfare study, and what the thoroughfare study suggests is that by going from 4 lanes to 3, you might reduce traffic accidents without impeding too much of the traffic flow. But that would have to be studied, as well as that intersection between Cleveland Street and Abbey. So I appreciate your feedback, and we've made notes of the 5 points that you raised about why it wouldn't work. So, I mean, if the consensus of the community is to leave Cleveland Street as it is, I still think the idea of consolidating the driveways wherever that's possible, where you have a property owner that might own several contiguous businesses, or property owners who are willing to share a driveway, it would reduce the number of times people are making those left turns, because that really does impede traffic flow. And we have the traffic data from NOACA. The number of the accidents on Cleveland Street is significant related to those turning movements. So that's really where it came from. Yeah. Jeff, go get it's really important that you go, because it records it for the...
The question covers a couple areas, Broad Street and Cleveland Street. How are you going to get the private property owners to cooperate with all this? Is it going to wind up to be eminent domain? Because you're going to, I don't know about the vacant buildings downtown, who owns them. You talked about some investors. But again, how are you going to get the property owners to cooperate with all this projection?
I think that's a great question, and what I'll tell you is we are not going to get every single property owner to agree with everything, and we're not going to get everybody to agree with everything in the same way that I can't get both of my children to eat vegetables. It just doesn't work that way. But what you do is you make the case monetary. It's always a monetary case, and I don't care who you are. If you own a piece of property and you want to increase not only the value of that property, but the return that you're getting on that property, there needs to be enough of a monetary incentive for you to do that. And so for every single one of these, you're making a case by virtue of saying to them, we know there's a gap in what you're currently doing. We can offer you a solution that provides you additional funding sources to fill the gap, and over a period of time, more money. And that's ultimately all that this story is at the end of the day. I will tell you that in communities I work with across the country, I run into a couple of different stumbling blocks. One is the older property owner who isn't going to do anything because when they die, they want to give this to one of their children, and they want their children to make the decision. And no matter how much money I show them they're leaving on the table by virtue of waiting and holding the property and not doing anything with it, they refuse to do anything. And you know, 6 years after I leave, and I come back to that community, that property owner has passed on, their kid have sold that property, and it's moved forward. So there's that sort of stumbling block that you will run into. But for the most part, what you're looking for is not 100% participation, because you know that's unrealistic, but priority participation from key property owners who are in this targeted area where you've incentivized them through your public process that we talked about previously to do that. But I think it's a great question, and it's a good point to start from, is that we can't expect everyone to do it, but we put these ideas and incentives out there and we tell them, look at what the market says you can do, because I think a lot of folks don't know that. They don't understand sort of that there's a potential even though there's a gap. They, as property owners, may not be that sophisticated, may need that partnership. They may know it, but they may not know that the city is willing to partner with them and do these pieces. So I think it's a little bit of an education process and iterative back and forth with them. But I think that's a great question. Did I leave anything out? No?
This pertains to actually all the areas where, when you did the analysis, did you guys look at any of the city ordinances or what areas were zoned for, like, you know, it's only zoned for retail and we're trying to now, you know, build a apartment building on it?
Yeah, I mean, the downtown area was developed, the way that Midway was developed as a retail district, downtown was developed for retail on the first floor and offices up above. It would be a change both in zoning and in use. The building codes change if you go from office use to residential use. And so this would mean an adaptive reuse kind of rehab project. So there are things that are going to have to change. And when Abby and Heather talk about non-financial incentives, these are some of the things that the city can do. They can change the zoning, they can adapt their codes, they can. So it isn't just about putting money on the table, but it's also about changing regulations if this is what you want to see happen. And I just want to really underscore something is that we don't have an agenda here. I mean, if you all don't want to see some of these things happen, I mean, we welcome this kind of input because at the end of the day, the only way this plan gets implemented is if there's consensus in the community that this is how you want to move forward. So we're not pushing you in any of these directions. But if there's community will to have more of a mixed-use residential environment downtown, then the zoning code will follow, you know, and the city will work with property owners to make it happen. Same with Cleveland Street. I mean, if there's opposition to making it happen, if the traffic study and the city streets department find that this doesn't work, then we don't want to advocate for it either. I mean, the only way you move forward to implementation is if the community wants to see these ideas happen. Jeff, there's someone behind you.
I think the 3 lanes on Cleveland Street is good. I was on there today and almost died. There was a semi on the side of me that was taking just a little bit too much of a lane, and I was trying to compensate, and then another semi is coming that way, and I almost got killed. Now, that's my experience on Cleveland Street, so something has to change about that flow, and maybe instead of extending more trees, which I love, you could have a bigger place for people to pull over for if the sirens are going or something. But I do think it's dangerous the way it is with 4, because there aren't really 4, and we do have winter for a long time, so that means 1.5.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any other comments, questions? You know, it's a little bit past 8. But we're welcome. We're happy to stay as long as you have comments. If you would rather, all of us will be here, so if you want to come up and share with us your comments or questions, concerns. And Mayor, did you want to wrap?
Thank you so much for coming tonight and your patience and hopefully your perseverance. It was a lot of information to receive all at one time, and obviously we've got our, sorry, I broke my rule. Obviously we've got our work cut out for us, but I think we're up to the challenge, and we've got 3 areas to target. We're obviously going to begin yesterday, and we're going to need the public will and the public support and the private sector support behind us as well. So again, it won't happen overnight, but it will begin to happen, and we hope you're there rooting it on. So thank you so much. And, oh, by the way, we aren't going to, once the final report is issued, we will be offering updates, regular updates, so we're not sure how often we're going to do that, but it's likely our consultants will be back maybe to make a presentation to council and hopefully eventually adopt this process. And then beyond that, as we move forward, there'll be opportunities for you, the community, to interact as we move forward on these pilot projects and give some additional input. So you haven't heard the last of it. You'll continue to get invitations to similar meetings like this, and we'll keep you abreast of the progress as we go. Okay, thank you.
Why do I have to do all the raking?
Because I'm old, and I said so, and you're closer to the ground.
Shouldn't I be out embracing my youth while I'm still young enough to enjoy it or something?
You should be embracing this rake before it embraces you.
Man, next summer I'm going to one of those reach and rise camps. I guess I'll go get a garbage bag and start picking some of this stuff up.
No, hang on. You don't use a garbage bag for that. Use one of these. They're paper. That's what you're supposed to use for grass and leaves.
Why? What's the difference? They all go to the same place.
No, that's not true. We put grass and leaves in paper bags and take them to the compost facility on Chestnut Street. The bag is made of paper, so it will break down and compost, just like the stuff inside of it. That's just good old-fashioned science.
Oh, so is that what you mean when you say you're going to drag the old bag out to sea all the time? See for Chestnut?
Yep.
Wouldn't it be easier just to throw it away with the rest of the trash?
It would be easier, but it also would be wrong. When grass decays, it creates these gases that are no good for anyone, and all it does is take up space.
Like you after Thanksgiving dinner?
Don't sass me. When you compost it, you turn it into something useful. Fertilize it. It lets us put stuff we don't need anymore to good use instead of just throwing it away. That's just common sense.
All right, whatever. Hooray for science. Can I stuff some of these branches in here too?
No, those you bundle up and put on the curb for the city. They have a chipper truck that comes around and grinds it all up.
All right, got it. Leaves and grass go in a paper bag, and branches get bundled onto the curb. If I finish that, can I do something else?
Sure.
Cool.
You can wash my car.
Hey, Ricky, hold on. Wait up.
Oh, hey, Rodney, what's going on?
Well, I was thinking if you're going by the river, maybe you could take this tire.
The river? What are you talking about?
The river? If you take tires and other stuff they don't take in the normal trash down by the river, it magically disappears.
You're not serious right now.
Magic!
First of all, if you take the stuff down to the river to get rid of it, the only thing that's going to magically disappear is money from your wallet. And that's if you're lucky and they don't just haul you off to jail. Ohio Revised Code says that you can be fined up to 25 grand and spend 2 to 4 years in jail for dumping scrap tires illegally.
For what, a couple of tires? Come on.
Tires, paint cans, household waste like bug spray, cleaners, fluorescent bulbs, e-scrap. It all has to be disposed of properly for safety's sake. They're not trying to make more work for you, it's just that it's not good for us in the environment. Think about it like this. They decided that this stuff is so unsafe it can't be kept with the other garbage.
Oh, I didn't know that garbage was so picky about the company it kept.
If you get rid of this in a landfill, it's going to eventually end up in the water table. So it'll be in the food you eat and the water you drink. You might as well take this tire, put it in a blender, and drink it.
So what'd you call that? A Michelin julep? No, wait, a gargarita.
Are you done? Because if you're done, we can take this and I'll show you where it actually goes.
Yeah, I'm kidding. Where do we gotta go?
You take this to the Lorain County Solid Waste Collection Center, 540 South Abbey in Elyria. They don't charge you anything, but you do have to get the stuff there yourself. So put your tire in and we'll take you down and I'll show you how to get rid of this stuff safely. There's no magic involved, but they will make your hazardous waste disappear.
No magic at all?
Mostly science, I think.
Science! It'll work.
I'm turning on the radio.